On a bitterly cold, rainy night in Brooklyn, Cora Mercer, a poor young widow clutching her last few dollars on the way to buy her mother's medicine, came upon a ragged old woman, trembling and about to stumble into oncoming traffic. Without a second's hesitation, she took off the wool coat that had belonged to her late husband, the only keepsake she had left, draped it over the woman's shoulders, and pressed every coin she owned into her hands. "Why would you give a stranger the last coat of your dead husband?" the old woman asked, stunned. "Because the cold never asks for anyone's name before it kills them," Cora answered softly, then walked away into the rain, never noticing the black car parked at the corner, or the pair of eyes silently watching her. What she could never have imagined was that the beggar she had just saved was the mother of the coldest, most powerful man in the city, a crime boss who forgave no one, except the woman who gave before she ever knew who she was. And when the clip of her handing charity to a beggar was posted online to humiliate her the next morning, no one could have guessed that this single moment of shame would pull her into a world of blood, power, and a love she would believe she never deserved. If you want to find out what happens when a poor widow's kindness reaches the frozen heart of a mafia boss, hit like and share this video. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next episode. The next morning, the pale sunlight filtering through the cracked window of the cramped rented room wasn't warm enough to drive away the cold that had seeped into every old brick. In the place where Cora lived with her mother and younger sister, the only two people she had left in the world, Ruth lay curled up on the bed, pushed against the wall, her breathing labored and broken, one gaunt hand pressed against her chest, as though she were trying to hold together the frail heart that was failing a little more each day, while Sadie, her younger sister, who had just turned 18, sat silently in the corner, clutching a worn medical record book, her clear eyes struggling to conceal a fear no girl her age should ever have had to carry. On the rickety wooden table lay an overdue hospital bill, bearing a sum so large that Cora couldn't bring herself to read it a second time. Beneath it, the notice stated plainly that if the family failed to pay within 7 days, Sadie's surgery would be postponed indefinitely, and the meager assistance from the city's medical charity fund, the only thing still keeping her mother alive, would also be withdrawn by order of powerful people Cora had never once met. She pressed the gentlest kiss to her mother's forehead, whispered that everything would be all right, then stepped outside with the last of her hope resting on an interview at a small diner where they had promised to hire her to keep the books, because she knew that numbers were the only things in this world that had never betrayed her. But the moment she reached the door, the owner looked at her with a strange expression tinged with contempt, his finger moving across the screen of a phone displaying a video that was being passed around the entire city. It showed her giving everything she had to a strange old woman on a rainy night, accompanied by a cruel caption calling her a ragged woman who liked to play the saint, someone who couldn't even feed herself yet still gave handouts to beggars. The owner shook his head and told her he couldn't hire someone the whole of social media had turned into a laughingstock, that her reputation had become poisonous, and Cora merely stood there in silence, allowing the humiliation to crawl down her spine without shedding a single tear. Someone nearby sneered that kindness from the poor was nothing more than stupidity, dressed in the robes of virtue, and she raised her head, her voice so calm that the very person who had mocked her fell silent. "A woman could be so poor that she had nothing left to lose," she said, "but no amount of money could buy her the right to treat another human being as human, and no ridicule could ever take that right away." She turned and walked off beneath the curious stares, her heart heavy as she thought of the 7 short days that remained and the price she had just been forced to pay for her kindness, because in this cold world, people could forgive selfishness, yet punish compassion offered at the wrong moment. All afternoon, she knocked on one door after another, asking for any work that would bring in money, from washing dishes to copying ledgers at night. But the video followed her like a shadow to every threshold, and with each rejection, she felt her hope grow a little thinner. When night fell and she dragged herself home with empty hands and hunger gnawing at her stomach, she stopped for a long while before the clouded window of a closed drugstore and stared at her reflection, a 27-year-old widow who had buried her husband after an accident 2 years earlier and had carried the weight of an entire fading family on her shoulders ever since. Then she told herself that she wasn't allowed to collapse. Not today. Not while her mother and sister still needed her. What Cora couldn't have known, at the very moment she believed the entire city had turned its back on her, was that somewhere behind high walls and cold iron gates, someone had watched that video over and over again, not with laughter, but with a brooding, unreadable gaze, and an unsent letter had already begun to change her fate forever. The following day, when the last of the silver coins had vanished and despair had begun to gnaw at her every thought, Cora carried her fragile hope to the hospital, where Sadie was about to undergo the surgery that would determine the course of her entire life. To beg for a little more time, she knew she had no right to ask for. The woman seated behind the cold desk in the administrative office regarded her through silver-framed glasses, her voice as flat and measured, as if she were reading out a sentence. The assistance that kept her mother's hospital bed and made her sister's operation possible didn't come from the hospital's budget, she explained, but from the Marchetti Foundation, a medical charity controlled by the powerful Marchetti family. A single nod from them could save a life, while a single shake of the head could close every door in the city to poor people like her. Cora quietly asked whether even compassion in the healing profession had to seek permission from people who had never known suffering, and the woman merely shrugged and replied that people weren't saved by mercy in this place. They were saved by signatures, while mercy was a luxury only the wealthy could afford. Cora stood motionless before those words, feeling with painful clarity that the world she lived in was governed by invisible hands tightening around the throats of the weak. Then she entered the hospital room where her mother lay and forced a smile to conceal everything. Ruth took her daughter's hand and said in a faint, breathless voice that she had lived long enough, that Cora should let her go and save every penny for Sadie, because no mother could ever be at peace while watching her child sell away her entire youth in exchange for a few more fading breaths. Cora could only tighten her hold on that gaunt hand and say that as long as her mother was still breathing, she remained Cora's entire sky. There were debts in this life that people repaid with money, but there were others that could only be repaid with the whole heart, and the debt owed for the gift of life was one Cora vowed to honor until her final breath. In the bed beside them, Sadie offered her sister a weak, reassuring smile. Though only 18, she still tried to appear brave even as her lips had turned pale from the pain that had tormented her for so long. And it was that quiet courage that made Cora feel she had no right to surrender. She left the hospital with a resolve bordering on recklessness and went straight to the pawnshop at the end of the street. With trembling fingers, she removed the simple wedding ring she had worn for so many years, the last keepsake left from her late husband after she had given away his coat. But the pawnbroker merely glanced at it and named a price so cruelly low that she understood even her grief could be bargained down by strangers. She searched for a loan, but the moneylenders looked at her as though she were prey and demanded terms no honest woman could ever accept. With every door that slammed shut behind her, Cora felt herself sinking deeper into an abyss where no light could reach. When darkness once again settled over the bitterly cold streets of Brooklyn, she sat huddled on the steps of a shadowed church, her arms wrapped around her knees, and for the first time after so many days of holding herself together, she allowed a few silent tears to trail down her face. She didn't weep because she regretted the kindness she had shown. She wept because she feared her goodness would never be enough to save the people she loved. Yet even in that moment of greatest weakness, Cora lifted her face toward the moonless sky and told herself that if the whole world had decided to trample a woman simply because she had dared to give when she had nothing left, then she would prove to them that a person's dignity wasn't measured by the money in her pocket, but by her ability to keep loving in a world that had forgotten how to love. And she had no idea that not far away, hidden in the darkness of an expensive car, someone had been watching every weary step she had taken throughout that long day, silently committing to memory the face of the woman who had given before she ever knew whether anything would be given back to her, and that her fate was about to turn in a direction no dream would ever have dared imagine. The next morning, a sleek black car pulled up beside the church steps where Cora sat. Rocco, the chief bodyguard of the Ferraro family, stepped out and delivered an unexpected job offer with a generous salary. Desperate to save her family, Cora accepted and was driven straight to the Ferraro estate. Gino, the silver-haired steward, stepped forward with a respectful bow and introduced the newcomer as Salvatore Ferraro, the cold-blooded head of the family who oversaw every operation of their vast empire. Unbeknownst to everyone in the room, Carmela was watching quietly through a hidden camera from a private study, deliberately keeping her presence a secret to protect the identity of the old woman Cora had saved. In the days that followed, Cora buried herself beneath towering stacks of ledgers as though hiding from the outside world, working from before sunrise until long after the city had fallen asleep, because she understood that every passing hour purchased one more breath for her mother through the sheer force of her devotion. And in the silent language of numbers, she found a strange peace that her turbulent life had never granted her. It was through that merciless attention to detail that, late one night, when every light in the mansion had gone dark and only the dim yellow glow of the desk lamp fell across her pale face, a small entry hidden among hundreds of expenses from the restaurant chain suddenly caught Cora's eye, a solitary figure that seemed harmless, yet made her professional instinct quiver like a string plucked on the wrong note. She followed that number as a hunter follows a faint trail through the snow, comparing one page after another, and gradually, a distorted shape began to emerge from behind the fog of carefully arranged entries. 3 different suppliers with 3 different names were all funneling money into a single account, concealed behind layers of intermediaries, while false invoices had been woven among legitimate transactions so skillfully that only eyes hardened by poverty and suspicion could have recognized them. The deeper Cora dug, the more clearly she saw that this wasn't the clumsy fraud of some ordinary greedy man, but the intricate work of a cold and patient mind, someone who knew every hidden passage within the machinery of the family and understood how to make each stolen dollar disappear without a sound, someone who had been hollowing out this family from within for a long time, without anyone ever knowing. But when she tried to follow the thread to its very end and uncover the face behind it, every trace dissolved into nothingness, as though an invisible hand had erased each path the moment she touched it, and Cora understood that this person was close enough to be smiling at her across the dinner table, and powerful enough to conceal himself in the very heart of the family. She didn't rush to accuse anyone, because bitter experience had taught her that an accusation without proof could be more dangerous than silence, and that if a powerless woman like her dared point a finger at a shadow with influence, she might be the first one crushed beneath it. So she quietly took notes, made copies, and arranged every vague fragment of evidence in a safe place, waiting for the day when the tangled thread would reveal its own end. The following morning, when Salvatore entered the office wearing his customary cold expression to inspect her progress, as though he were still waiting for her to make some mistake, Cora merely placed a concise report before him and calmly said that money was quietly leaving the family through doors, disguised with extraordinary care. She couldn't yet identify the person behind it, but she was certain that the worm his mother suspected was real, and that it was buried very deep. Salvatore picked up the report, his eyes moving over every line, and Cora saw a fleeting change cross the face that never revealed emotion, a frown born not of anger but of astonishment, because the figures she had just exposed were something an entire team of his highly paid advisors had failed to notice for months. He raised his eyes and studied her for a long time, and for the first time, his gaze no longer held contempt. In its place was something closer to caution and respect. Then he quietly asked how long it had taken her to uncover what everyone else had failed to see, and Cora simply replied that numbers never lied. Only people taught them how to lie, and her work was nothing more than listening to what they were trying to whisper. Salvatore remained silent for a long while, a heavy silence carrying both suspicion and admiration, before folding the report and telling her to keep digging, but to exercise the greatest possible caution, because when someone touched the money of a person willing to murder his own conscience to possess it, what they gambled was no longer their job, but their life. And for the first time since entering that cold and forbidding house, Cora sensed that the wall of ice between her and that man had formed its first crack. Fragile, but real. The fragile piece Cora had only just found didn't last long, because one afternoon, while she was bent over stacks of ledgers, the office door flew open without so much as a knock, and a stunning young woman swept inside, with the proud stride of someone who believed the entire world had been created, to kneel at her feet. Her golden blonde hair fell loose around her shoulders, while her designer dress and glittering, expensive jewelry displayed a wealth she deliberately flaunted, as though to remind the woman before her of her lowly place. She was Siena Marchetti, daughter of Don Aldo Marchetti, the head of the family that controlled the very medical foundation from which the fate of Cora's mother and sister now hung by a thread. With a sweet smile steeped in poison, she introduced herself as the fiancée chosen for Salvatore by their 2 families, the woman who would soon become the true mistress of this house. Siena looked Cora up and down with contempt. She made no effort to conceal, then remarked that she had heard all about the impoverished woman the whole city had turned into a laughingstock because of her foolish generosity. She found it quite amusing, she said, that a ragged creature like Cora had been allowed to set foot in such an exalted place, like a sparrow that had wandered into an eagle's nest and somehow imagined it could share the same sky. Cora didn't lower her head. She merely replied with calm dignity that she had come there to work, not to compete with anyone for a position, and that a person's worth wasn't measured by the glittering stones they wore, but by what remained when all that splendor had been stripped away. The smile on Sienna's lips hardened into a thin, cutting line. Unwilling to tolerate someone she considered beneath her, speaking as an equal, Sienna decided to teach Cora a lesson. She stepped forward and shoved a thick stack of files toward her, piled so high it resembled a wall, then said with feigned sweetness that since Cora claimed to be such a gifted accountant, surely she would have no difficulty reconciling the complete books of all 3 businesses in a single night. The full report was to be on Salvatore's desk before sunrise. Otherwise, Sienna would have all the proof she needed to show everyone that the woman his mother had taken under her wing was nothing more than a useless fraud who had deceived the entire family into trusting her. It was a volume of work that would ordinarily take an entire team nearly 2 weeks to complete. A carefully constructed trap designed not to test Cora's ability, but to drive her toward a failure already decided in advance. Sienna stood with her arms folded, waiting to see despair appear on the face of the woman she wanted to crush. But Cora only studied the tower of files in silence, then lifted her gaze and looked directly into Sienna's eyes. She said that she would do it, not because she feared Sienna's threats, but because she had never learned to run from a challenge. And if someone wished to set a trap, they should first make certain that their prey wasn't a woman who had spent her entire life learning how to survive one snare after another. She pulled the files closer, and with the composure of someone who had learned that the best answer to contempt wasn't tears, but results, she began turning through the pages beneath the late-night glow of the lamp. Sienna remained rooted to the spot for a moment, stunned by what she had heard, before turning sharply and storming out, leaving behind a spiteful remark that she very much looked forward to witnessing Cora's self-inflicted humiliation. When the door closed, and the only sounds left in the room were the soft rustling of paper and the steady ticking of the clock as it moved toward dawn, Cora drew a deep breath and let her hands move swiftly across the familiar figures. Within her, a cold and piercing thought began to take shape. Powerful people often made one fatal mistake when they underestimated a woman simply because she was poor, because poverty itself had forged within her a strength of will that no amount of money could ever buy. And tonight, she would turn the trap her enemy had laid into a stage, upon which she would prove her own worth. That night passed beneath the steady rustle of turning pages and the lonely glow of a desk lamp. But Cora didn't throw herself at the mountain of files like some desperate soul racing against time. She worked with the discipline of a skilled professional who understood that this trap had been designed not merely to attack her competence, but to stain her honor. So alongside verifying every figure, she carefully recorded the time the files had been delivered to her, photographed the condition of each folder, and marked every place where supporting documents should have been included, but had been suspiciously left blank. She soon realized that the trap was far more intricate than she had imagined, because several crucial original records had already been removed. No matter how gifted she might be, the reconciliation would remain incomplete and become evidence of the very incompetence Sienna intended to pin upon her. Yet instead of panicking, Cora only smiled coldly, because she understood that those empty spaces were themselves the sharpest weapons of all. A deliberate omission always carried the fingerprints of the person who had arranged it. She quietly made several copies of every piece of data in her possession and hid them in different places, like a soldier carefully concealing ammunition before a battle. Then, while the sky was still dark, she went to the mansion kitchen, where several servants and members of the night staff remained awake. She spoke to them gently and skillfully persuaded them to confirm the condition of the files when they had been delivered to her, gathering the testimony of ordinary people whose existence the powerful so often forgot. While she was still working diligently in that cold room, one of Salvatore's men quietly knocked on the door and placed the missing documents on her desk, offering no explanation beyond the brief statement that these were papers his employer believed she would need. Cora looked up and, through the doorway, caught a fleeting glimpse of the tall man standing silently in the darkened corridor, his gray eyes fixed upon her with something that was no longer simple suspicion. She understood that he had been quietly watching the trap unfold and had discreetly returned the stolen pieces to her, not with comforting words or a loud display of protection, but through the guarded action of a man unaccustomed to showing kindness. A strange warmth stirred gently within her chest, in the heart of that bitterly cold night, though she hurried to extinguish it, reminding herself that in this world, no gift was ever given without conditions. When the first rays of sunlight touched the window frame, the completed report lay neatly on the desk. It not only reconciled the accounts of all 3 businesses down to the last dollar, but also included an appendix identifying every document that had been removed, together with the relevant times and the testimony of the staff. A trap intended to humiliate her had become a silent indictment, pointing directly at the person who had deliberately arranged it. When Sienna entered eagerly with Salvatore, wearing the triumphant expression of someone expecting to witness Cora's downfall, she froze at the sight of the flawless report resting neatly before her. Cora merely explained with quiet composure that she had completed the assignment on time, then politely noted that several original documents had disappeared from the files before they reached her hands, a detail that the person who had assigned the task could perhaps explain better than anyone else. Sienna's face went pale with anger and confusion, while Salvatore shifted his gaze from the report to the slender woman standing before him with her back straight, and for the first time, his eyes held an admiration he could no longer deny. When Sienna stormed out after bitterly warning that this wasn't over, Salvatore told Cora in a low, quiet voice that he had never seen anyone turn a trap into a shield with such remarkable skill. Cora simply replied that she wasn't wealthy enough to choose to run away, so she had been forced to learn how to stand her ground. And in the moment their eyes met, amid a silence that lasted longer than necessary, they both felt that something had shifted between them. A fragile spark had been kindled between two people who seemed to belong to worlds that could never touch, and though they both hurried to deny it, that flame had already begun to burn in silence. Not long afterward, the Ferraro family hosted a lavish gala to strengthen its alliance with the Marchettis. An evening when the entire hidden circle of power in the city gathered beneath glittering crystal lights. Cora was required to attend as the woman responsible for the accounts, though the invitation stirred within her the uneasy feeling that another trap lay concealed behind it. Her instinct proved correct. A small note delivered to her in advance stated clearly that the evening called for simple, elegant attire, so she obeyed and wore the most modest dark dress she owned. Only when she crossed the threshold of the ballroom did she realize that every woman of rank and privilege was dressed in magnificent evening gowns, draped in luxurious silk and blazing diamonds, while Cora stood amid that sea of light like a solitary shadow out of place. Every gaze turned toward her, and quiet laughter, edged with contempt, spread through the room. Sienna, who had secretly arranged the deception over the dress code, approached with a triumphant smile and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. She said it was pitiful that some people couldn't tell the difference between a high society gala and a pauper's market, and that there were those who, even when granted the chance to enter a world of grandeur, could never conceal the common roots from which they came. Surrounded by hundreds of judging eyes, a weaker woman would have dissolved into tears and fled the ballroom, but Cora merely lifted her head. Her slender shoulders remained straight, and she walked through the crowd with such calm dignity that her very composure gradually silenced the laughter, because she understood that dignity didn't lie in the clothes a person wore, but in the way they carried themselves, and that a noble soul could shine more brightly in the plainest cloth than anything wrapped in silk. When Sienna still refused to relent and continued to sneer that a poor, lowly creature would remain exactly that no matter where she stood, Cora turned and looked directly into her eyes. In a voice as calm as it was sharp, she replied that a dress could be made with money, but character couldn't. A person might purchase every gaze in the room, but could never buy the sincere respect of a human heart. She hadn't come there to compete with anyone's appearance. She had come only to perform her work honestly, something not every splendidly dressed woman in that room could proudly claim. Her answer plunged the entire ballroom into silence and sent an angry flush across Sienna's beautiful face. At that very moment, while the tense stillness hung over them all, Salvatore slowly approached from the far end of the room, his cold gray eyes sweeping across the crowd with an authority that left everyone holding their breath. Then, to the astonishment of all present, he stepped to Cora's side, removed his elegant evening coat, and draped it over her shoulders. With a dark, lethal gaze that swept across the terrified crowd, he spoke in a low, dead silent voice that commanded absolute terror. "Anyone who dares disrespect the woman of Salvatore Ferraro in my house will no longer have a tongue to speak tomorrow." The declaration struck like thunder beneath a clear sky, instantly shattering the marriage arrangement between the two families that the Marchettis had worked so carefully to build. Don Aldo Marchetti's face darkened, and Sienna nearly lost her footing, while the entire ballroom plunged into a suffocating silence of pure dread. Cora turned toward Salvatore with her eyes wide in disbelief. She understood that this wasn't a declaration of love, but a calculated move, a shield he had raised to protect her from the claws poised to tear her apart. Quietly, she told him that she could cross the room on her own, and didn't need anyone to rescue her. Salvatore merely looked at her, a trace of hard resolve touching the corner of his mouth, and answered so softly that only she could hear. He knew she was strong enough to stand on her own, but some predators waited only until they caught the scent of solitude upon their prey before attacking, and he wouldn't allow that to happen beneath his roof. Standing beside each other, amid the radiant lights and hundreds of envious, searching eyes, with one alliance newly shattered and another feud newly kindled, both Cora and Salvatore dimly sensed that the declaration intended as nothing more than a political move had drawn them closer than anything before it ever had. From that moment onward, their fates had been bound together by a cord that neither of them could easily sever. When the gala came to an end and the last guests had departed, carrying with them the still smoldering rumors of the engagement that had just been announced, Cora found a secluded corner of the balcony where she could escape the lights and the prying eyes. She breathed in the cold night air and tried to bring order to the turmoil within her, only to realize that Salvatore had quietly stepped outside and was standing beside her, his gaze fixed upon the glittering city below, with a brooding expression she couldn't decipher. Cora softly asked why he had done something so reckless before an entire alliance of powerful families, merely to protect a stranger like her, and there was something in her voice that carried both gratitude and caution, because she had no wish to become a pawn in a game whose rules she didn't understand. Salvatore remained silent for a long while, then said in a voice deeper and rougher than usual that he wasn't accustomed to standing by while an innocent person was torn apart by wolves. When she started to answer, he suddenly turned toward her, and a flash of possessiveness crossed his gray eyes, something even he hadn't expected. He asked what she had spent the entire evening discussing with the young man who had stood beside her during the party. The question escaped before reason could stop it, exposing a jealousy that a cold and guarded man like him should never have allowed himself to reveal. Cora stared at him in astonishment, but instead of evading the question, she gently told him that she was his fiancée only in name and as part of a calculated move, and that he had no right to possess her heart or every word she spoke. The candor of her answer seemed to touch some hidden wound within him, and his face tightened for a fleeting moment. After a long and heavy silence, Salvatore slowly began to speak. He told her why his heart had turned to ice. Many years earlier, his father, who had led the family at the time, had been secretly betrayed by his closest confidant, a man everyone in the household had regarded as one of their own, in exchange for power and money. His father's death had taught Salvatore a brutal lesson, that the warmest smile sometimes concealed the sharpest blade. He said that from that day forward, he had learned never to trust anyone. He had learned to regard every act of kindness as an investment, merely waiting for the day when its debt would be collected. And he had sealed the doors of his heart so tightly that no one could ever enter and betray him again. To him, betrayal was the one sin that could never be forgiven, a wound that even time couldn't heal. Cora listened in silence, and there was no fear in her eyes, only a tender sorrow. She told him that she understood what it felt like to have the whole world turn its back on you, and she understood the pain of having your trust trampled beneath someone else's feet. But she had also learned that if you allowed the fear of betrayal to turn you into a sealed fortress, then in the end, you were only punishing your own heart and driving away even those who had never intended to hurt you. She told him that the distance he had created to protect himself was also the wall that imprisoned him in loneliness, and that no matter how deeply a heart had been wounded, it still deserved another chance to trust, because living without the courage to believe in anyone was no different from existing inside a prison without bars. Her simple yet profound words made Salvatore turn and study her for a long time, as though for the first time in his life, someone had seen through his frozen armor and touched the true man trembling beneath it. And in that moment, between two people who carried wounds much like each other's, a quiet understanding began to grow, more intimate than any declaration of love. He said nothing more. He simply stood beside her in the stillness of the night, but Cora could feel that another crack had formed in the wall of ice surrounding that powerful man's heart. She also understood that her own heart was beginning to waver before something she didn't dare name, a dangerous feeling that a woman in her circumstances should never have allowed herself to possess. She hurried to close herself off again, reminding herself that between an impoverished widow and a powerful crime lord lay an abyss that even the truest feelings might never be able to bridge. Only a few nights after the declaration that fractured the alliance between the two families, while Cora was still awake late over the ledgers in the study and the entire mansion had sunk into sleep, The silence was suddenly torn apart by chaotic sounds rising from the front courtyard. Tires shrieked against the stone, men shouted, and footsteps thundered in every direction, tightening her heart with a dark sense of foreboding. It was the retaliation the Marchetti family had been secretly preparing to avenge the humiliation of the broken engagement. A surprise attack in the dead of night meant to warn the Ferraro family. In the moment the entire house descended into chaos, Cora heard a terrible cry, followed by the heavy sound of someone collapsing just outside the corridor. When she rushed out, she found Gino, the kind-hearted old steward who had guided her through her earliest days there, slumped against the wall, his face pale with pain. Most people's instinct when confronted with danger was to run and save themselves, and in this place, no one would have blamed a frail woman for shrinking back in fear. But Cora didn't run. She dropped to her knees beside the old man, her trembling hands pressing urgently against the wound that was slowly draining the strength from his body, desperately trying to hold on to the life quietly slipping away from that aging frame. Amid the chaos and flickering darkness, she kept her voice as steady as she could, repeatedly urging Gino to breathe evenly and stay with her. She tore a strip from the hem of her own dress to make a temporary bandage. And though her hands shook, every movement was strangely precise, because she remembered the years she had spent caring for her ailing husband and sickly mother, years that had taught her how to preserve a life at its most fragile threshold. She shouted for someone to bring medicine and call an ambulance, commanding the terrified servants with such conviction that they instinctively obeyed. Throughout that stretch of time, which seemed to last forever, she never left Gino's side. Her hands continued pressing firmly against the wound even after exhaustion had made them ache, and her lips continued whispering reassurance, as though the strength of her will could pass into him and keep him there. When Salvatore returned after subduing the attackers, the first sight that struck him amid the wreckage of that terrible night was Cora's slender figure kneeling on the cold floor. Her sweat-drenched, trembling hands were still fighting to preserve the life of the old steward he regarded as family. Her face was stained and pale with exhaustion, yet her eyes burned with an unshakable resolve. He stood motionless in the doorway for a long moment, and something within his chest, the fortress of ice he had spent so many years carefully building, suddenly trembled to its foundations. He understood that this woman owed Gino nothing. She could have turned and fled like anyone else, yet she had remained. She had set aside her own safety to save a man she had no obligation to save. When Gino was finally taken away and had passed beyond immediate danger, Cora sank onto the floor, her hands still trembling from the tension that hadn't yet released her. Salvatore walked over, silently removed his coat, and draped it around her shaking shoulders. Then, in a voice rougher than she had ever heard from him, he asked why she had risked herself for a stranger. Cora looked up at him, weary but with her eyes still clear, and answered that a person's pain didn't become any smaller simply because the one suffering was someone they didn't know. If everyone waited until they had enough reason before reaching out to save another human being, then the world would have grown so cold that no one would have survived. To her, a human life would always be worth more than every calculation of gain and loss. Her simple words rang through the quiet night, like a bell striking directly against Salvatore's heart. And he looked at her with eyes that had changed completely. What he felt was no longer the suspicion of a man always guarding against betrayal, nor was it merely admiration for her abilities. It was something warmer and far more dangerous, a stirring so deep that, for the first time in his life, he didn't want to deny it. In that moment, he understood that the woman sitting before him, with her courageous heart and selfless compassion, had quietly passed through the wall no one else had ever managed to cross, and he would never be able to look at her the same way again. Ever since that terrible night, something between Cora and Salvatore had changed. The cold distance that once separated them gradually gave way to quiet moments together, to late-night meals he deliberately lingered over, to the times he stopped by the study only to watch her bent intently over the ledgers. And within that silent intimacy, both their hearts had begun to echo with feelings neither dared confess. One night, as a gentle rain fell and the moon slipped in and out behind the clouds, Salvatore found Cora sitting alone by the window, her distant gaze fixed upon some place in the past. He sat beside her and asked what she was thinking about that had left such sadness lingering across her face. Cora remained silent for a while. Then, as though she no longer wished to hide anything from this man, she slowly began to tell him about her life. She spoke of the unbearable weight she had carried for years, holding both a mountain of debt and the illnesses of her mother and sister upon her slender shoulders. She told him that she could no longer remember when she had forgotten what it felt like to live for herself without fearing what tomorrow might bring. There had been nights, she confessed, when exhaustion had hollowed her out so completely that she wanted only to surrender, but then the image of her mother's face and the look in Sadie's eyes would pull her back to her feet. She had learned that a woman like her had no right to be tired, no right to be weak, and certainly no right to dream of beautiful things that belonged only to those more fortunate than she was. Then she lifted her eyes to him, and within their tearful brightness lay the depth of all her secret shame. In a choked voice, she told him that she knew her heart was losing its way, that she had allowed herself to feel things an impoverished widow like her should never have permitted herself to feel. Between a woman like her, burdened by an unfinished past and possessing nothing, and a powerful man like him, lay an abyss that even the sincerest love could never fill. She was afraid she was merely deceiving herself with a dream that would soon shatter. Salvatore listened to every word without interrupting her. When she finished, he reached out and gently raised her face until their eyes met. Then, in a deep, warm voice she had never heard from a man so accustomed to coldness, he told her that he didn't care whom she had once belonged to or what losses she had endured, because he wasn't marrying a past, nor did he choose a person by what she held in her hands. He said he had spent his entire life in a world where everything could be bought with money, where every smile concealed an intention, and every sweet word hid a dagger. It was a world so filthy that he had forgotten what purity looked like until he met her. The woman who had given away her final keepsake to a stranger on a rainy night, without asking for anything in return. He told her that what he treasured in her wasn't her beauty or her talent, but the beauty of a soul that still knew how to love despite immeasurable suffering. It was the goodness within her, something neither poverty nor the injustices of life had managed to stain. That soul, he said, was the purest and most precious thing he had ever touched in the whole of his shadowed life. Cora stared at him in stunned disbelief, and the tears she had held back for so long finally slipped down her cheeks, not from humiliation, but because for the first time in many years, someone was looking at her not as a burden or a pitiful creature, but as a human being worthy of love and tenderness. He gently wiped the tears from her face and told her that dignity wasn't something one person bestowed upon another. It was something she had always possessed, even throughout her darkest days, and she had as much right to dream as anyone else in this world. In that moment, beneath the pale moonlight and the soft patter of rain beyond the veranda, two hearts bearing the same wounds found one another in closeness and understanding. Although they both knew that countless storms still waited ahead, they allowed themselves to sink into the rare peace of that moment, a moment in which love, fragile though it was, had quietly begun to take root between two worlds that had seemed destined never to belong together. But happiness in the world of powerful men was always as fragile as a candle flame trembling before the wind. For even as the feelings between Cora and Salvatore quietly began to blossom, a vicious conspiracy was taking shape in the darkness, molded by hands that couldn't bear to see them find peace. Sienna, who still nurtured a bitter hatred after her engagement had been broken, and she had been humiliated before the entire upper class, sought out an ally no one could have suspected. He was Bruno Salerno, the trusted advisor whom Salvatore regarded as his right hand, a man who always wore an open and loyal manner, while concealing ambitions of his own beneath it, along with a growing resentment toward the strange woman who kept probing numbers no one was ever supposed to touch. The two joined forces in a dark alliance, and they understood that if they wanted to destroy Cora, they couldn't rely on ordinary humiliation, which would only make her stronger. They had to strike directly at the most vulnerable place in the man protecting her. They had to awaken Salvatore's deepest obsession, his fear of being betrayed by the very person he trusted. They began weaving an intricate web of lies, arranging for Cora to cross paths by chance with an unfamiliar man in a small cafe, a federal agent named Rourke whose identity she knew nothing about, then secretly recording the encounter from carefully chosen angles that made an accidental meeting appear no different from a clandestine exchange arranged in advance. Bruno didn't stop there. With his authority and intimate knowledge of the family's inner workings, he skillfully fabricated messages and sophisticated money transfers in Cora's name, making it appear that she had secretly leaked family information to investigators, while also draining the very fund she had been entrusted to protect, turning the woman who had exposed fraud into the one accused of committing that same crime. It was a trap so cruel it sent a chill through the soul, for it had been designed not only to bring Cora down, but also to strike the wound in Salvatore's heart that had never healed. It revived the memory of the trusted friend who had betrayed his father years ago, so that once doubt was planted, his own obsession would take root, grow, and slowly strangle every trace of reason within him. When Bruno placed the false evidence on the table, wearing the counterfeit anguish of a loyal man forced to reveal a bitter truth, he whispered that he would rather die than be the one to bring such terrible news, that he didn't want to believe it either. But every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction, and that perhaps the woman their household had taken in was nothing more than a snake they had welcomed beneath their clothes. Salvatore held the photographs and documents in his hands, and Cora wasn't there to see his face darken little by little, to watch the gray eyes that had only just begun to know warmth freeze once more into ice, or to witness the fortress she had believed she was breaking through, quietly rebuilding itself, one wall at a time. Inside him, a brutal war was raging between a mind poisoned by carefully planted evidence and a faint voice from his heart that stubbornly insisted the woman who had knelt amid blood and chaos to save Gino couldn't possibly be a traitor. But the fear that had been buried deep within him for so many years was a powerful poison, and each time he looked at the evidence again, the voice of his heart grew weaker. Bruno and Sienna watched silently from the shadows, knowing they had planted the seed of suspicion in the most fertile soil imaginable. Now they needed only to wait for it to take root, grow, and choke to death the fragile love that had only just begun to bloom. Cora, meanwhile, had no idea that an invisible blade was hanging above her head, that the very kindness and integrity that had brought her this far were now being twisted into a noose, or that the most terrible storm of her life was about to descend upon her, a storm that would test not only the love that had begun to kindle between them, but also the faith of the man who had sworn he would never trust anyone again. Just as the seed of doubt had taken root in Salvatore's heart, Don Aldo Marchetti decided to deliver the decisive blow, because the old man understood that to crush a strong woman, one couldn't strike at her pride, but had to strike at the very people she loved most. He had Cora secretly brought to meet him in a locked room, and with the cruel composure of a man accustomed to deciding the fates of others, he reminded her that the Marchetti Foundation was the very hand keeping her mother in a hospital bed and giving her younger sister a chance to undergo surgery. His power reached into every hospital in the city, and with the slightest snap of his fingers, every door to medical care would close before her family, leaving no place willing to treat those two fragile souls clinging desperately to life. He gave her a condition as cold as a death sentence. She was to leave Salvatore immediately and disappear from his life. She was to pack her belongings, leave the city, and never return. Otherwise, she would be the one sending her mother and sister to their deaths. With a vicious smile, he told her that he was allowing her to choose between a frivolous romance and the lives of her own flesh and blood. Cora stood frozen before the threat, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had suddenly collapsed. She understood that she had been driven to a merciless crossroads where, no matter which path she chose, her heart would be shattered. On one side stood the first man who had ever seen her true worth and made her brave enough to dream of happiness. On the other were her mother and sister, the two people for whom she had already sacrificed everything, and for whom she was willing to sacrifice everything once more. Throughout that night, Cora sat beside her mother's hospital bed, looking at the woman's wasted face and Sadie's small hand, and she understood that for someone who had spent her life making sacrifices, there had never truly been a choice at all. Her heart could break, but her conscience could never survive if she allowed the people she loved to die, simply because she had selfishly wanted to hold on to her own happiness. She remembered once saying that there were debts that could only be repaid with the whole of one's heart, and now fate was forcing her to repay the debt of birth with the happiness that had only just begun to bloom. So through silent tears, she made the most painful decision of her life. She would leave without saying goodbye and without offering any explanation, because she knew that if Salvatore learned the truth, his nature would compel him to wage war against the Marchetti family to protect her, and then not only her family, but Salvatore himself, would be drawn into danger. She chose to let him misunderstand her. She chose to bear the shame and carry the full weight of the pain alone. In haste, she wrote a few brief, cold lines telling him that she was leaving because this had only ever been an arrangement, and now the time had come for it to end. Then she quietly gathered her few belongings and walked out of the mansion beneath the silence of the night, leaving behind everything her heart had ever longed for. But fate, in its bitter cruelty, had arranged for her departure to come at the most devastating moment of all. Just as Cora vanished, Salvatore was holding the forged evidence Bruno had placed before him, evidence claiming that she had been an informant and had embezzled money from the Foundation. In the eyes of a man already writhing beneath the agony of betrayal, her sudden disappearance without a word was nothing less than a confession, living proof that she truly was a guilty woman who had fled the moment her scheme was exposed. Salvatore stood in the empty room, his hand crushing the cold note she had left behind, and every faint whisper of his heart that had once defended her was now completely drowned beneath the fury of a man who believed he had just been stabbed in the back by the very woman he loved, exactly as his father had been betrayed so many years before. A bitter, hollow laugh escaped him as he mocked himself for having been foolish enough to lower his defenses and cursed himself for daring to believe that another human being could ever be different. Meanwhile, somewhere in the cold city, Cora bowed her head and wept uncontrollably because she had been forced to leave the man she loved beneath the cruelest misunderstanding imaginable. Two hearts were breaking over a truth that had been twisted beyond recognition, while neither of them knew that they were both victims of the same vicious hand concealed in the shadows. And in the darkness of that night, two people who had nearly touched happiness were driven to opposite sides of an abyss, created by hatred and deceit, each holding only one half of the truth, neither realizing that this misunderstanding was the greatest victory their hidden enemy had ever hoped to achieve. In the dark days after leaving the Ferraro mansion with a shattered heart, Cora found refuge in a squalid rented room where she could hide from the world. But instead of allowing sorrow to drag her into the depths of despair, she dried her tears and reminded herself that weeping had never saved anyone, and that the only way to protect the people she loved and clear her name was to uncover the truth that had been buried. She pulled out the backup copies she had quietly preserved from the earliest days of examining the family's ledgers, the scattered traces of suspicious cash flows she had once discovered, but had never been able to connect to the mastermind behind them. This time, with the clear mind of someone who had nothing left to lose, she began fitting each clue together like the broken pieces of a mirror. She compared the times when money had disappeared with the movements of those who had access, followed intermediary accounts concealed behind layer upon layer of shell entities, and slowly, a name began to emerge from the thick fog, a name that made even Cora shudder when she recognized it. The man who had been carefully bleeding the family dry for years was none other than Bruno Salerno, Salvatore's most trusted advisor, the man who always stood beside him wearing the devoted expression of a loyal servant. The deeper Cora ventured into that maze, the more horrifying her discoveries became, because the money Bruno had stolen hadn't remained idle. It had been flowing quietly in a single direction, and when she followed it to its final destination, every trail pointed toward the Marchetti family. A chill ran down her spine as she realized that Bruno and Don Aldo Marchetti had secretly joined forces long ago, that the traitor within the household and the enemy beyond its walls had woven a ruthless conspiracy together, draining the Ferraro family's strength from the inside while waiting for the right moment to overthrow Salvatore and allow Bruno to seize the position he had always coveted. Every scattered piece now fit together with terrifying perfection. Her false accusation of being an informant and stealing from the fund, the effort to force the engagement with Sienna forward, the use of her family as hostages, all of it had been part of the same game. The final objective had been to remove her, the only pair of eyes sharp enough to see through Bruno's dishonest numbers, while sowing enough suspicion to divide her from the one man capable of protecting her. Cora understood that numbers alone wouldn't be enough to bring down a man as powerful and cunning as Bruno. He could easily deny everything and place the blame elsewhere. She needed a living witness, a voice from within his own machinery, and she remembered a servant at the mansion named Comfort, whom Bruno had once coerced into carrying out underhanded tasks, a poor woman burdened by family responsibilities much like Cora herself. She approached Comfort not with threats or money, but with the sincerity of someone who understood her suffering. Cora sat with her and listened to the fears and regrets tormenting the woman's conscience, then told her that some mistakes were made only because people had been driven into a corner, but there always came a moment when they could choose to stand with the truth and reclaim peace within their own souls. The servant, who had spent countless nights tormented by the guilt of having taken part in Bruno's crimes under his command, finally broke down in tears and confessed everything. She admitted that Bruno had ordered her to falsify documents and help conceal his suspicious transactions, and she agreed to testify, ready to stand beside Cora and expose the traitor's true face, despite the dangers waiting ahead. With the carefully organized evidence and the witness's invaluable testimony now in her possession, Cora stood silently beside the window and looked out over the city at night. Her heart still ached from the bitter misunderstanding with Salvatore, but a flame of determination now burned in her eyes, one that nothing could extinguish. She understood that she wasn't merely fighting to clear her own name. She was fighting to save the man she loved from the blade, poised to strike him in the back, wielded by the very person he trusted most. She reminded herself that a woman standing alone could be abandoned by the entire world and beaten down to the very end. But as long as she still held the truth in her hands, she possessed a weapon more powerful than any wealth or authority. The time had come for her to return and force the darkness to pay for everything it had done. On the other side of that separation, within the Ferraro mansion, which had grown colder than ever, Salvatore lived out his days like a shadow. Although his fury at being betrayed had rebuilt the wall of ice around his heart, something continued to torment him and refused to let him go. A faint yet persistent voice rising from the deepest place within him, insisting that something about this entire story wasn't right. Night after night, he sat alone in the darkness with a glass of liquor he never bothered to touch, turning over in his mind the image of the woman who had knelt on the sweat-soaked floor to keep Gino alive without any thought for her own safety. He wondered how a heart willing to risk everything for a helpless old stranger could belong to a cold-blooded traitor, and how those clear eyes that had once told him honesty was her last remaining possession could be the eyes of a liar. He remembered Cora telling him that if the fear of betrayal was allowed to turn a person into a sealed fortress, then in the end, that person was only punishing his own heart and driving away even those who had never meant to hurt him. Now her words echoed through his mind like a warning, forcing him to realize that perhaps he was repeating the very mistake she had cautioned him against. Unlike the man he had once been, the man who always allowed fear to guide him, Salvatore decided not to rush to judgment this time. He summoned Rocco, the loyal bodyguard who had stood beside him through countless storms, and ordered him to quietly investigate the entire matter again from the beginning, verifying every piece of evidence used to condemn Cora, instead of blindly believing whatever had been placed directly into his hands. Rocco began his work in silence, with the meticulous care of a seasoned soldier, and it wasn't long before he started noticing cracks in what had appeared to be a flawless picture. The recordings of Cora's encounter with the unfamiliar man had been filmed from angles that seemed far too deliberate, as though every camera had been positioned in advance. The messages and transactions bearing her name had been created at times when she had clear proof that she was somewhere else, and when every clue was traced back to its origin, they all led to a single source: the hand of the man who had personally presented the evidence. Rocco brought his findings to Salvatore and cautiously told him that he couldn't be certain, but every trace suggested that someone within the household had deliberately arranged the entire deception to destroy the young woman. The name he hesitated to speak was Bruno Salerno, and Salvatore fell silent as a slow horror began spreading through him. He started searching his memory for everything connected to his trusted advisor. He remembered that Bruno had always shown displeasure whenever Cora examined the ledgers, that Bruno had been the most eager to accuse her, and that Bruno alone possessed both the authority and the knowledge required to fabricate everything with such perfection. A terrible suspicion began taking root within Salvatore, one even more frightening than Cora's supposed betrayal, because it reached toward the very man he had trusted as his own flesh and blood. Salvatore understood that if this was true, then he hadn't merely come close to losing the woman he loved because of a false accusation. He had also been harboring a traitor at his side, a venomous serpent wearing the mask of loyalty and waiting for the right moment to strike a fatal blow. He cursed himself for allowing fear to cloud his judgment so completely that he had nearly driven away the only person who had ever been sincere with him. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Cora was also clutching evidence and a witness's testimony in her hands as she prepared for the day when the truth would be revealed. Although the two of them remained separated by a chasm of misunderstanding and pain, fate had quietly arranged for their paths, beginning on opposite sides of the same sorrow, to draw steadily toward a single point, the same truth, and the same hidden enemy. And though neither Salvatore nor Cora knew anything of the other's efforts, they were both taking the final steps toward the moment when every mask would be forced to fall, when the trust stolen from them would be restored, and when the darkness that had concealed itself for so long would finally be dragged into the light and made to face the price of its sins. The fateful day finally arrived, when the two most powerful families in the city gathered for a grand meeting in the magnificent hall of the Ferraro mansion, a meeting that outwardly concerned an alliance, but beneath the surface was a chessboard. Bruno and Marchetti had already prepared. Bruno believed this was the perfect opportunity to overthrow Salvatore, whose position had been shaken by the alleged betrayal, while Don Aldo Marchetti waited to force the Ferraro family to bow in submission under the guise of reconciliation. Bruno rose in the middle of the hall with the confidence of a man certain of victory, and began making veiled accusations that Salvatore had grown weak and lost his judgment by allowing a female spy to penetrate the very heart of the family, and that the time had come for a steadier hand to seize control. Just as he thought he was about to grasp the position he had always coveted, the great doors of the hall flew open, and Cora walked in beneath hundreds of astonished gazes. She was no longer the ragged woman who had once been crushed beneath the weight of suffering, but a woman holding her head high, with the fiery eyes of someone who carried the truth in her hands. The entire hall fell silent. Salvatore sprang to his feet, unable to conceal the shock in his eyes, while Bruno's face drained of color for a fleeting instant before he struggled to regain his composure and shouted that the traitor still had the audacity to show her face again. But Cora merely looked straight at him and said in a voice that was calm, yet sharp as ice, that the true traitor was often the one who accused others most loudly, because darkness feared the light more than anything else. She placed folders of documents, financial statements, and evidence of the money that had been siphoned away over the years upon the long table. Speaking through the language of numbers that no one could dispute, she revealed piece by piece how Bruno had cleverly embezzled the family's assets through phantom suppliers and disguised accounts. Then she exposed how he had secretly joined forces with the Marchetti family, transferring the stolen money to their enemy so they could weave a conspiracy to overthrow the very man who had trusted him most. Bruno roared that it was all the invention of a bitter woman seeking revenge. But at that moment, Cora gave a signal, and a servant named Comfort stepped forward from the rear of the hall. Trembling but resolute, she confessed before every guest that Bruno himself had forced her to falsify documents and fabricate all the evidence used to frame Cora. Her living testimony fell like the final hammer blow, bringing the entire wall of his deception crashing down. Don Aldo Marchetti hurriedly rose to deny any involvement, and loudly declared that no one had the right to accuse a man as powerful as he was, based solely on the words of a servant and an accountant. But at that very moment, a composed voice filled with authority rang out from the far end of the hall, and Carmela Ferraro slowly stepped forward, elegant in bearing, but with eyes sharp enough to make the entire room hold its breath. She approached Marchetti and Bruno, then said in an unhurried voice that all this time, everyone had believed the true power of the family rested in her son's hands, but they had forgotten that the person who had built everything and still quietly held the most important strings had never truly left the shadows. She had watched them all in silence from the darkness, waiting for this very day. Then, to everyone's utter astonishment, Carmela turned toward Cora, and the sternness in her eyes softened into tenderness. She said that the time had come to repay a debt, then signaled for someone to bring forward an old wool coat. It was the very coat that had belonged to Cora's late husband, the one she had given away on that cold and rainy night so many years ago. Carmela revealed that the trembling, ragged old woman Cora had rescued that night had been none other than herself. The hall erupted in murmurs of disbelief, while Cora stood frozen in stunned silence. Carmela looked at her and said that on that night, Cora had given everything she possessed to a stranger, without knowing who she was, and without expecting anything in return. In that single moment, Cora had shown her something that even her immense fortune could never purchase. A soul whose compassion remained whole in a world rotted by greed. Before them all, she declared that the woman they had humiliated and crushed was the purest person in the room, and that those who mocked kindness simply because they believed the poor and powerless could never strike back were the most contemptible of all, because kindness wasn't foolishness. It was the noblest form of courage a human being could possess. Salvatore looked at Cora, then at the old coat, and in that moment, every piece within his heart finally fell into place. Every misunderstanding dissolved like mist beneath the morning sun, leaving behind a depth of remorse and a love more powerful than ever for the woman who had fought alone to save both her own honor and his entire family. Bruno and Marchetti stood there with bloodless faces, knowing that the fortress of lies they had so painstakingly built had completely collapsed beneath the weight of a truth they had grievously underestimated. When the curtain of lies was finally torn apart and the truth stood naked before every pair of eyes, the fate of those who had spread darkness was decided in the very hall they had once imagined would become the stage for their triumph. Salvatore stepped forward and stopped before Bruno. The grayness in his eyes was no longer ice, but the absolute coldness of a man who had just seen betrayal laid bare to its deepest roots. In a low, steady voice, more terrifying than any outburst of rage. He told Bruno that he could forgive weakness, and even ambition, but he could never forgive a man who hid beneath the cloak of loyalty only to stab the person who trusted him in the back, because no sin in this world was more cowardly than betrayal disguised as kinship. He didn't need violence to bring his enemy down, for the weapon Cora had placed in his hands was sharper than any blade. It was the truth, preserved as evidence no one could deny. Salvatore declared that every record of the embezzled funds, the shadowy transactions, and the conspiracy between Bruno and the Marchetti family would be turned over to the authorities so the law could determine their fate. Bruno, who only moments earlier had stood arrogantly certain that power was within his grasp, now watched his former associates turn their backs on him as every trace of his authority within the organization was stripped away in an instant. The reputation and position he had spent so many years building crumbled like a castle raised upon sand, and he was escorted out of the hall beneath the contemptuous stares of all those who had once respected him, carrying with him the bitter ending of a man who had lost everything to his own bottomless greed. Don Aldo Marchetti couldn't escape the storm whose seeds he himself had sown. When the evidence revealed that he had manipulated medical funds to threaten desperate families and conspired to drain the wealth of an allied family, both the influence and the power he had spent years accumulating were shaken to their foundations. The partners who had once bowed and scraped before him hurried to abandon him, and the empire that had seemed unshakable began to fracture from within beneath the weight of truth and the judgment of the law. Cora stood there watching the men who had driven her and her family into the deepest reaches of suffering finally face the consequences of their own crimes. Yet there was no triumphant satisfaction in her heart, only a quiet and weightless peace, because she understood that true justice wasn't found in revenge. It was found when the truth was finally restored to its rightful place. Those who sowed the wind would inevitably reap the whirlwind, and that was a law no amount of power or money could evade forever. Her honor, once blackened and trampled before the entire city, was now completely restored in front of the very people who had despised her. Carmela stood beside her, took her hand, and told everyone that this woman wasn't someone upon whom the family had bestowed a favor. She was the benefactor of the entire Ferraro family. She wasn't an opportunist who had slipped into another family's home, but the woman who had stood alone to protect that home from a blade concealed in the darkness. Salvatore immediately ordered every threat hanging over Cora's family to be withdrawn, and he personally guaranteed that all of Ruth's medical expenses and Sadie's surgery would be fully taken care of, not as repayment or a debt to be negotiated, but as something that should have been done long ago. He promised that from this day forward, no power in the city would ever again use the lives of the people she loved as hostages to threaten her. Cora's eyes burned as she listened, because for so many months she had carried the fear of what tomorrow might bring for her mother and sister entirely on her own. She had sacrificed her own happiness to keep them alive, and now that crushing burden had finally been lifted from her shoulders, leaving behind a sense of relief she hadn't dared to dream of in far too long. She imagined Sadie's face when she learned that the operation would go forward. She thought of her mother no longer lying awake in fear over overdue hospital bills, and for the first time after so many years lost in suffering, that resilient woman allowed herself to believe that perhaps life did know something of justice, that no matter how deeply kindness was buried or beaten down, it would always find its way back to the light, and that good people, however many storms they were forced to endure, still deserved the promise of a peaceful tomorrow. After the truth had come to light, and every injustice had been redressed, Cora stood by the window of her room in the mansion, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Now that her honor was fully restored, and the shadows of betrayal had been cleared, Cora turned around and walked straight into Salvatore's private study, where the light was still burning, ready to build a future together, on equal ground. Salvatore looked up from his desk, his gray eyes softening the moment they met hers. Before he could speak, Cora walked up to him, her head held high, her voice steady and filled with quiet resolve. She told him straight to his face that she loved him, but it was precisely because she loved him that she couldn't stay as a hidden liability. She refused to live in the shadow of his protection, wondering every day if her presence would cost him his peace or his life. She wanted a love built on equal ground, where she stood beside him as a partner, not a burden he had to guard with blood. Salvatore stared at her in stunned silence, his breath catching in his throat. For a man accustomed to people running away from him in fear or manipulating him for power, hearing a woman calmly look him in the eyes and demand equality not out of anger, but out of fierce, Protective love shattered the last remnants of his defensive walls. He stood up slowly, walked around the desk, and gently took her hands in his. There were no hidden notes, no tearful midnight flights, and no cowardly escapes. Instead, looking directly into her eyes, he pulled her close and whispered that she would never be a burden, and if she wanted to stand beside him as an equal, he would clear the entire world of its dangers so she could do just that, right by his side. And so, the story of Cora and Salvatore must pause here, at a place where love and self-respect, pain and hope are woven together, allowing each of us to continue writing the ending within our own hearts, because sometimes the most beautiful endings are beginnings that have yet to reveal what lies ahead. If this story has touched your heart, please don't forget to press like and share the video so these meaningful stories can reach even more people. And please subscribe to our channel so that every day you can listen to many more compelling and moving stories. How do you feel about the story of Cora and Salvatore? What kind of ending do you hope they will find together? Please leave a comment below and share the feelings from the deepest place in your heart, because we always long to hear what your heart has to say. May everyone listening to this story always be blessed with abundant health and a life filled each day with joy, peace, and love. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next videos.